Good morning, guys. Yeah. Hi, Holger. Hi. I'm just going to introduce us. Yes. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We don't have a full house yet, but I'm sure the panel here will keep you fully informed. We're ready to start the day. I hope you enjoyed last night's gala dinner. What an amazing location, what an amazing entertainment. And what a way to finish the night with that duet on the piano. That is quite memorable. So congratulations to all the airports that won the awards yesterday, and to our very own HR in Hermes. So well done for that. So I think a warm, loud applause for Hermes for hosting us last night and the generosity. Thank you very much, Hermes. So, 2 working sessions today. The first one, the fourth in a row, given the 3 yesterday, focuses on investors' perspective on sustainability and business development. And to chair this event, our moderator is Holger Lingweiler. He's a managing director in Avial Alliance, and he's also the vice chairman of the board of directors in Athens International Airport. So, Holger, over to you. The floor is yours to introduce your panelists.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are happy to have this session here. I'm understanding that last night was long and the last session as well. But we do our best and would like to give you a little bit our view on that thing. On the panel we have Andy Carlyle from Ferrovial, Werner Kerschel from IFM, Anthony Martin from Aegis, and Sani Taitinen from Vantage. And I would like to ask them to introduce themselves and as well to talk about their background, their company, their assets a little bit. Who starts?
Well, I can get started since I just showed up and I wasn't here last night drinking. So, so Sami Taitinen from Vantage Airport Group. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the group. We have 7 equity investments at different airports, anything from Cyprus to airports here to LaGuardia in New York City, and then all the way to a place called Kamloops in northern Canada in British Columbia. So, and then we do we're a little bit different as well from the perspective that Vantage actually does management and operations as well as development of the airports, and then also we serve as an investor. So we kind of do holistically across the whole border. So and my role is Group Chief Financial Officer. So I try to keep ourselves funded occasionally. So that's it.
Okay, thanks. Andy?
So Andy Carlyle from Ferrovial. Ferrovial has been an investor in airports since 1998, so 21 years actually. We've invested in about 34 airports. Currently in the portfolio we have 5 investments, so Heathrow, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Southampton, and in 2017 we took on the concession in Denver in the US. And airports is cool. We have a sort of structure of a team that is a very sort of active investment, and I'm part of that team really in helping to work with the airports to realise the opportunities we see and manage the risks as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Andy. My name is Werner Kerschel. I work for an Australian infrastructure fund manager called IFM Investors. We currently manage about $35 billion across our assets, of which 20% of that is invested in airports. So we've been invested since 1997 in Australia when it all privatized. And our portfolio comprises 16 airports. In Europe, the Manchester Airports Group is Manchester, East Midlands and Stansted, and in Austria, Vienna Airport, and Malta and Košice. And in Australia, we've got stakes in all airports other than Sydney, in all major airports. So given we best invest money on behalf of pension funds and with a long-term view without having to exit our investments, obviously sustainability is a key focus of our long-term thinking and planning.
So hello, I represent Aegis Group. So Aegis is a major engineering company, but also active in road concession and airport concession. So we are an investor in an operator in 16 airports. This includes Hermes Airport. So we are a co-shareholder with partners, including Vantage. And so we operate 5 regional airports in France and Belgium, 4 airports in French Polynesia, and also 4 airports in Western and Central Africa. So we are a subsidiary of Caisse des Dépôts, which is a major French state-owned investor.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps just to say a little bit about our company, we are investor in airports. We own stakes in Athens, Budapest, Hamburg, Düsseldorf, and San Juan. We were invested in Sydney, but unfortunately Sydney is listed, and that was not in the mandate of our current owner. Having said so, we want to discuss the sustainability and appetite of different investors into airports, but perhaps one question before. How sustainable are we with our funding, our own funding, to be a sustainable partner to the airports or the stakeholders there?
Who wants to go first? I went last time.
Sorry. I mean, I'm happy to take it for us, obviously. As a fund manager, we see a lot of inflow from pension money. So we raise capital every quarter and look for that sustainable investment. And I think the one message, obviously, as a financial investor and industry investor is we've seen the competition to be quite strong as well. And with regard to airports and the market in generally, we are interested in airports, but I think we have become much more selective in terms of what we're looking at. But capital is there, obviously.
I think what we've seen is there's a lot of primary and secondary market transactions, and from the funding perspective, we just did our latest fundraising, and it was very successful and in excess capacity in the market for us at least. But we look at it look at our airports and our future investments as well as a network of airports and the strength behind that, and then so haven't seen any issues right now, and particularly in the U.S. market, we see substantial interest from the investors to pump more money into the market that requires substantial infrastructure investment in airports, and we'll be heavily focused on airports though. So that's our core.
I mean, likewise, I think the market for investment is really strong, continues to be strong. As Werner said, there's definitely a very competitive market out there. So I think increasingly everyone is focusing on areas where they've got particular strength or particular characteristics of assets where they can think they can make the most difference and therefore be the most competitive, put together the most competitive package. But access to funding is not really an issue, both for the existing assets as well as for new transactions as well.
Sustainability is a very important aspect from grantors, so especially in the primary markets and public authorities. So in addition to be an investor, you need to be, I would say, a sustainable partner. And so these aspects are more and more demanded by public authorities in the frame of the concession contract, and you really have to deliver a strong project on that aspect.
So I think it's a good thing that we have here all long-term investors on the table or at the table with a non-limited lifetime, so no private equity and no infrastructure fund which has to sell after 8-10 years or whatever, because to discuss the sustainability of the long-term view is always perhaps limited in that case, and therefore that is a question which we need to have in mind when it comes to long-term views on investments. But coming to your investment appetite and your geographical markets, are you focused on Europe, or are you as well open for, let's say, emerging markets? You mentioned Australia is not really emerging, but not Europe at least. So what is your view in either to invest in stable markets, mature markets, or going more for growth in emerging markets? And
I think, from our perspective, it's actually a case, and increasingly about having perhaps a portfolio covering different aspects, and certainly each airport one looks at, you have to just look at that individual airport and the context in which it sits. There are no sort of hard and fast rules. Clearly you look at the macro, the political, in deciding areas you want to be. I mean, we are invested and wish to invest in Europe, Asia, South America, all areas we're very active in. And North America is a market we've identified the last couple of years where we've set up an office there, and we think there will be opportunities. There will be a very different type of model, perhaps than we've seen in Europe and other parts of the world. But we do see more and more opportunities for private capital to come in. So that's an area we're kind of quite focused on at the moment. But yeah, in a way, you have got to evaluate each individual opportunity on its merits.
So basically, we want to diversify geographically. Historically, we have been more in French-speaking countries, but Aegis Group is present in more than 80 countries, and we can develop some synergies. I think the most important aspect is to find good partners, because we generally do not invest alone, so we're interested to bring our know-how in operation and road development, commercial development, but we want to be with investor, financial investor, possibly also other operator. The key aspect is really to find good partners, also including local partners. This is really a condition to focus on one project in a different part of the world, Southeast Asia, Africa, where we have identified a significant upside.
From our side, we've been investing in North America since 1994. So, and I mentioned earlier that we don't only invest, but we want to be managing and operating that airport as well and redeveloping it. So I think we look at the world holistically, and if the risk profile is the right one, and if we can actually go in and do all of those things, meaning manage, operate, develop, and make a difference on that airport to make it actually something different than what it used to be, we'll look at those opportunities. But ultimately, I'd say if we had to categorize right now, we'd be looking at North American market much more heavily. It's a different model. We think we know that model, but at the same time, we do look at Europe opportunistically and kind of just like Anthony said, outside of that realm, if we have the right partners, we'd be looking at emerging markets as well. But I think our risk profile kind of pulls us back from those markets if we don't think that we have the right mix of the partnership on a partnership level. And oftentimes finding partners in emerging markets tends to be difficult, particularly if you want to actually manage and operate and develop the airport as well. So.
And just to add to that, I mean, our fund mandate is an OECD mandate, and we tend to have equity ticket sizes somewhere between $300 million up to $6 billion. So in that regard, a wide spectrum of opportunities. And we also see that for certain situations, Manchester Airports Group, for example, is well known, is bidding for Sofia Airport, and similar to your situation, Holger, where you can use the experience and the expertise in the airports to actually get that competitive edge. I think what I'd just like to add is that given the competition in the market and the number of operators looking at opportunities, the number of financial institutions looking at opportunities, we've seen that political and regulatory risk especially is completely mispriced in general infrastructure at the moment. So in that regard, we're very wary of both when we look at investments, and that reduces to some extent the markets as well.
I agree with that. I see appetite of investors is very strong in emerging markets where the upside is the highest, but the competition is very tough. And so if you consider the premium paid for the last acquisition in countries like India or Brazil, so it's difficult. It's difficult because many players want to enter the market and are prepared to overpay for this.
I understand your role that you influence the airports, try to develop them to better airports, more sustainable long-term investments. But after the first, let's say, 3-5 years, 80% of the work is done, and then what happens then?
I think it's probably never done. Maybe at the time of the investment, you perhaps have a clear plan, particularly probably for those first 3-5 years. But I think the nature of our industry is it's constantly changing. The challenges we face, the sustainability issue over the last few years has definitely risen up the agenda, and therefore it's constantly, like any business really, it's just constantly changing. So you can't start with that's our fixed plan to go in, we're going to do that, and then we'll just sit back and relax. Heathrow, we've been an investor there. We've covered, we've invested 11 billion over the last 10 years or so in terminals and stuff. That was all envisaged and part of the plan. But the third runway wasn't really, necessarily on the agenda, which is obviously now, a big focus, and that constantly has now changed the whole sort of landscape for Heathrow as we go through the consultations. So, and the same with the other airports. It's things change, and you have to react and adapt to them. So I think that's the approach we take. We look for areas where we can bring sort of operational expertise to play. We have a sort of innovation lab and department that we very much continue to work with our individual airports in trying to identify ideas, road test different things across the portfolio, which hopefully benefit the group. So I think it's constantly changing what you need to do. But
how do you see your role in the relation with the local management, with the management on ground? Who is running the show, you or them?
Oh, it's their airport to run. We're just, if you like, shareholders. But I think there's a difference. Some shareholders, maybe on the pure financial side, are more sit back and focused on the numbers, and others where we've got expertise, obviously, in construction and airport business planners and airport operational people within the team. So you can help, particularly on some of the perhaps smaller airports like sort of Aberdeen and Southampton, where they don't necessarily have the internal resources to be able to do everything they like to do. So you can take advantage of that and help them. But,
And just to add to that, and your question, to what extent will airports become boring and dull? I don't think we've seen that in any of our airports in terms of the growth we've seen, in terms of the projects, in terms of the changes, both from the airlines and customer side and passenger side as well. That you always have to plan for that growth, and Vienna Airport is a good example where a new runway would take you 12 years to actually just get the permit to start planning the runway. So it's not that you can actually after 5 years finish thinking about what's going to happen in the future.
No, that was not really what I meant. I meant after the 5 years you have done the biggest part of the realization of the short-term value creation, and then you could just create a wonderful long-term business plan and sell it off.
Well, I guess it depends on your business model and whether you find someone who is willing to pay more than you think it is worth for you. But in that regard, I think the long-term development is all the representatives here think about that.
That's right.
Maybe just to address one of the questions in terms of returns involved in airport investing. That's obviously a very difficult question and not a straightforward answer. I would say they've come down significantly. I think there's obviously also a big difference between looking at an established airport or looking at a greenfield regional airport. But as I said before, we've seen, especially auction processes where cost of capital come to a very low return, and we're talking single digits and low to mid in that regard. Which obviously for, as I said, an asset that has traffic risk, an asset that has environmental risk, an asset that has regulatory and political risk, to some extent might misprice, but is a reflection of today's market and the capital available.
So how do you value these kind of risks? Just giving an example. If you have a good dictator which allows you to push your expansion through, then it's easy, and that is, let's say, the good part of that. On the other hand, if you have a stable environment with legal framework and so on, that has its value as well. But then the approval processes for growth are perhaps a little bit more complicated. How do you balance that kind of different perspectives, meaning political environment, expansion need, growth, things like that? Are there limits? So just countries which are a no-go or which are more difficult or which would need to...
Yeah, I mean, I think, inevitably there are parts of the world where you say, mind you, state of the world these days, political climate is becoming more unstable everywhere, but, where there are inherent political risks that might make it difficult. That doesn't mean you don't necessarily have a look at it and you evaluate if there might be something that's different. But I think particularly, sort of come back to the point, I suppose, about investing in airports after you've acquired them, sort of stability of return is key, and having a long-term kind of stable sort of, be it regulatory regime or long-term agreements with airlines that give you the confidence as an investor to invest that you're going to get a return. What that rate of return is subject to a sort of internal discussions. But yeah, that stability, I think, is allows you to invest over the longer term. Is
So long,
the key.
long term, concession is a long-term contract actually, and you need to be very reactive to large number of changes and constant changes, because things never happen as you would have thought. And I think first, the quality of the management is essential. You really need to have, because as a shareholder, as an investor, you're not operating on a day-to-day basis, so you really need to have strong management. So what concerns us, we see us as a long-term investor. So we are an operator, and we expect also some return in addition to our share in the revenues and dividend of the concession company. So we expect some returns in technical service agreement, also in engineering services. And this is a big part of the equation. And also, so we do not want to substitute to the management, because we trust the local management, of course. But we have a team, a small team, with experts. So bringing some services to the concession in specific aspect, like route development, for example, or maintenance management, or things like that.
Are you considering climate aspects when you invest?
We have to. But this is also, yes, expected in public tender. This is our social responsibility. I think more and more. So we have to include these aspects and these values into our strategy. And of course, we know that we catch attention of politicians, of media in this aspect, and of course we have to adapt and develop an environmental strategy, sustainable development strategy, and this is now part of our strategic plan, part of BEADS.
But, so maybe to go into that point, that when we do invest, well, first of all, we try not to cover the entire globe. We do look at the risk, maybe a little bit different than some specific funds that will be willing to invest it anywhere in the world. But so we fairly focus where we invest, and it comes down to political and legal risk and those type of things. But ultimately, in terms of the environment, particularly when we do invest in the airports, we start thinking about the sustainability and environment even before we actually invest. And when we start deciding the new development opportunities, if it's an airport or terminal, we take the entire life cycle of it into account, because we don't invest in airports that with the mentality that will be in today and out 5 years later. So we do look at the O&M cost for the life cycle, and then we think about things like how do we design the terminal so it can utilize natural light and those type of things. And then so yes, it's a kind of core of what we do in terms of investing in the airport as well. So
even if there are short-term costs involved?
Yeah, there's going to be short-term costs associated with it, but that's the difference. That if you're a short-term investor, you'll go in and you'll get your return and you'll sell it after 5 years. But that's not our investment profile, and that's not how we look at our investments. So we look at it again longer-term perspective, and we believe that doing the right thing from that front will lead into actually you getting your return on the back end.
That's why you can't ignore the issue of climate change, let alone impact on demand and many of the things we talked about yesterday. But just from a construction perspective, the type of terminals in different parts of the world, as to how climate might change in 20, 30, 40 years' time, and how that might affect. You need to understand that as an investor, so you've got a clear handle on what the costs are, so that's all built into your package.
But you also have to be flexible, because things do change, and the team here in Hermes, they continue to invest into opportunities. How are we going to reduce the carbon footprint, for example, and so.
Actually, we had a direct impact after having acquired San Juan, so we bought it just 2-3 months before the hurricanes went over this island, and effectively we got the full hit and 80 million of damage, and effectively the roof was blown away. Some ships were sitting on the runway, and the apron was flooded that high, and the terminal as well. So that's not the long-term impact, but there as well sometimes short-term impacts, and that is a point which we consider as well as something expected. We expected that to happen at a certain point in time, unfortunately not in that short term, but that has shown us as well that the long-term stakeholder relationship is of highest importance, as this airport was a hub for the Caribbean for supporting flights. We needed to reopen it within 24 hours with all that water on the apron and removing all that stuff. And that has shown us that climate is not just a theoretical thing, but a real issue. And now in rebuilding, we took this as well into account to improve the structures to make it more resilient and especially less dependent on the public electricity supply, because that was not that reliable. And with the function of being the relief hub for the Caribbean, you have a special responsibility as well in that context. So we have the long-term views in terms of investing in CO2 emissions to go down and being carbon neutral and stuff like that. But we have as well sometimes in investment just short-term impacts, which we have to handle and which remind us that this makes sense. But perhaps just two other aspects in that regard. The political environment, how do you deal with that? I mean, growth regions are sometimes led by persons with special definition of human rights, things like that. How do you deal with that?
I'm happy to take that, and it's an interesting one because our portfolio has assets globally, including Mexico and Turkey, for example, and our biggest risk is political and regulatory risk in the UK and Australia. So in that regard, it very much depends on the assets and the situations. I mean, obviously, as a financial investor, we're not here to make a political statement. So, any investor